Hi, welcome back to another SI video. So in this video, we'll be covering the fungi kingdom. So first we'll be looking at the anatomy and nutrient absorption of the general fungi style. Then we'll look at the also general reproductive style of these fungi. And then we'll finish off with talking about the 5 major groups of fungi and what makes them special. So first off, let's look at the anatomy. As you can see in this image, we're looking at a Basidiomycitis, which is just a typical mushroom type of fungus. And you can also note that there's 2 main regions or structures going on here. We have an above ground portion, which we call the fruiting body. This fruiting body is where we're going to have all the reproductive structures. So in this case, we have stuff like gills, which will eventually produce these spores. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. The second major area to focus on is this mycelium. So this is the underground portion of the, in this case, mushroom or of the fungus. This is going to be made up of all of these hyphae, which are these long root-like structures that are capable of secreting enzymes to break down their food, or if they're on dead matter, that's actually how they're breaking it down and absorbing it. Another thing to note is they have really thick cell walls made of chitin. And this allows them to retain water and all those nutrients and not lose it. Okay, so now let's quickly go through the general reproductive style of fungi. So some things to note about fungi is they primarily live their lives as a haploid organism. So remember that we denote that with just an N by itself. So let's start with looking at this mycelium. So remember, this is like the main body of the mushroom. So the mycelium is a haploid organism, and it will go through mitosis to eventually produce spore-producing structures, so like the reproductive part. Those structures, again, are still going through mitosis to produce spores that are genetically identical to the parent organism or parent fungi. Those spores are then going to be released, land somewhere, germinate, and then grow through mitosis to be a mycelium again. So that's the basic asexual style of reproduction. So now let's look at how they sexually reproduce. So what happens is, say we've got this mushroom, and it's on the ground, and it's got its mycelium hyphae network, and another spore lands on the ground somewhere nearby and starts going through mitosis and producing mycelium. Well, what's going to eventually happen is these mycelium or hyphae are going to get closer and closer. They'll produce pheromones to help guide each other to find each other. And eventually, they're going to touch tips, and there's going to be plasmogamy, which is the fusion of the cytoplasm. So we've got one cell of another organism. They're going to eventually fuse. And now we have this heterokaryotic stage, which just means that we have this special multinucleate cell. So keep in mind here, we're looking at a purple arrow because it's an in-between of being a haploid organism and a diploid organism, because we still have 2 individual nuclei in the same cell, but it's not technically a diploid yet, because diploid means that you have 1 nucleus with 2 sets of chromosomes. Eventually, as time goes by, these nuclei are going to fuse to form that zygote. So again, we have this karyogamy, this fusion of the nuclei to form our zygote. This zygote eventually will go through mitosis and produce a reproductive structure where it will undergo meiosis, which is just going to have the ploidy of the organism. So we're going to have our genome. So we are here 2N because we've fused that our two nuclei. So we have 2 sets of chromosomes. They're going to undergo meiosis, where there's going to be genetic recombination, and then we're going to produce spores that are now haploid again because we halved our genome. The spores are now genetically different from the parent structure, and they're going to go and land somewhere and then go through mitosis to produce another mycelium, and then from there, either cycle. So now let's look at the 5 major fungi groups. So I just want to point out in this chart, you see it says coda at the end of all of these. In lecture, it was CDs. That's just a nomenclature thing. Both are accurate, so if you see them, don't get confused. Okay. So let's first look at the Basidiomycites. So this is your typical mushroom. They're mainly terrestrial decomposers, but they can also be parasitic and mutualists. So an example is like a toadstool, mushroom, or shelf fungi. There's an image right here of toadstool. The major reproductive structure is called basidia. So if we look at this image here, I apologize, it's super blurry, but you can see here's our main fruiting body. You've got the cap, and on the underside of the cap, we have gills. These gills will have these special structures, basidia, that are lining them. And those structures is where we're going to see that haploid fusion into the zygote, which is now diploid, going through meiosis to produce those spores, which we call basidiospores. Okay, next let's look at the Ascomycetes. So these are generally decomposers, parasites, and mutualists. They can include single-celled organisms called yeasts. Blue cheese is an example of an Ascomycetes. They also will utilize both sexual and asexual reproduction, and they have these specialized spores called ascospores, and they form in the ascus of the organism. So here's another complex looking life cycle. Here's our fruiting body, or the ascocarp, and if we zoom in, we can see these special ascus where the ascospores get produced. Next, let's look at Glomerus CDS. These, again, mostly terrestrial mutualists. There's about 200 identified species. I think that's up to 230 now. They are symbiotic mycorrhizae. There's 80% of plants have this mycorrhizae, which essentially is just a type of fungus that aids plants in the absorption of nutrients, because plant roots don't have the ability to secrete enzymes to break down different matter. So they rely on fungi like mycorrhizae to break it down for them. So we'll look at a special type of mycorrhizae called arbuscular mycorrhizae in this image. So the blue area here, that's the fungus. So what happens is it kind of co-lives with these roots. It will actually penetrate the root hairs or the root directly, and then have these branch-like structures going into arbuscules where they're actually going to be releasing nutrients that the plant can absorb. And this looks like an invasive kind of relationship, but it's actually very beneficial to the plant. And many plants can't actually survive without having some sort of symbiotic relationship with a fungus. So now let's look at Zygoomyositis. These are decomposers, parasites, and mutualists. They're mainly terrestrial. They are, again, both sexual and asexual reproduction. Their main reproductive structure is called the zygosporangium, and this is also the common bread in fruit molds that we battle with all the time. Again, here's another life cycle just so we can point out those important structures. So here's our main fruiting body here. Again, you'll go through a sexual reproductive style where you will have a fusion of two haploid cells into that in-between heterokaryotic cell. Eventually will lead to the zygosporangium, so that's the key word in this. That structure will then lead to the zygote, forming that diploid nuclei, going through meiosis and producing the sporangium, which is where the spores are actually being released. Next, let's look at chytrids. So these are decomposers, parasites, and mutualists. They're mainly living in water or moist soil, and this is because of these flagellated spores. So these are the only fungi that still have flagellated spores because they live in these kind of environments where they need it to be able to move. So these are also the earliest fungi to evolve, and we can look more into this by looking at some trees. So here are our three main domains. We have eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. Fungi are right here in eukarya, so let's zoom in on that. Here's our eukaryotic tree, and if you recall, fungi are found in uniconta, and we can see the relationship of fungi to us as animals here, and why it's more related over, say, land plants. So keep in mind that animals and choanoflagellates here, our last common ancestor was most likely flagellated. Same thing when we go back to this node here, this is also most likely a flagellated common ancestor because of the chytrids that we see that also still have that flagellated spore. Okay, so going back to chytrids, again, just pointing out both sexual and asexual reproduction occurs. Some important features to remember is the spores are called zoospores in Chitrids, and this also still follows a similar asexual and sexual reproductive style to that of the general one I showed before. So here's a review of the major reproductive organs of the different classes of fungi. So Chitrids, remember, they have that flagellated spore. Zygoomyositis, they have that zygosporangium, which will eventually lead to the sporangium that will release spores. In Ascomyceus or Mycetes, they have ascus or asci for plural. I'll write ascus there really quick. This is also their major reproductive organ. Lastly, the basidia in the Basidiomycitis or Mycetes. So I hope this video helps explain how reproductive styles differ between the fungi and some major things to remember about each. I hope that was beneficial. Please sign in the sign-in link in the description below. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to send emails or attend office hours and ask questions. Thank you.